Welcome back to Contemporary Conversations on Christian Classics, where
Oh,
we explore timeless Christian content that continues to inspire today. We're continuing our deep dive
okay.
into Stephen Charnock's The Existence and Attributes of God. In Chapter 6,
Yes?
Charnock tackles a weighty concept,
Uh-huh.
the immutability of God.
It's fascinating how Charnock sets the stage for this discussion.
Right.
He anchors it in Psalm 102,
Mm-hmm.
specifically verses 25 and 26,
Okay.
which speak of the heavens and earth perishing.
Oh, wow.
But here's the twist.
Okay.
Even as creation seemingly crumbles,
Yeah.
God remains unchanging.
So we're talking about the most foundational elements of the universe, things we perceive as permanent, ultimately fading away.
Right,
Yet amidst this cosmic upheaval,
right.
God's immutability shines through.
It's a striking contrast
Yeah.
that forces us to confront the vastness of God's nature
Right.
compared to our limited temporal perspective.
Yeah.
And it begs the question, what does perishing actually mean here?
Right.
Is it annihilation or
Mm.
transformation?
Okay.
Charnock seems to lean towards transformation,
Okay.
pointing to the imagery of the heavens being folded up like a garment.
That's a powerful image.
Yeah.
It suggests a change in form,
Right.
a renewal,
Uh-huh.
rather than complete obliteration.
Yeah.
It makes me wonder if even the heavens and earth,
Mm-hmm.
the grandest parts of creation, are subject to change.
Right.
What does that say about our own lives,
Yeah.
our own experiences of change and impermanence?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And I think it gets to the heart of why this doctrine matters.
Mm.
If we're going to find any kind of stability,
Okay.
any kind of anchor in a world where everything is in flux, it has to be in something that transcends change.
Okay.
Charnock is pointing us to the one unchanging reality, God himself.
It's interesting how Charnock goes beyond just poetic imagery. He presents several arguments against the idea of annihilation. He talks about the concept of a new heavens and a new earth,
Right.
the enduring nature of God's covenant with his people, the need for a physical realm for resurrected bodies.
Okay.
He even brings up the intriguing idea that creation itself groans
Yes.
and awaits the glorious liberty of the sons of God.
It's as if Charnock is suggesting that even the inanimate world
Wow.
is longing for a future state of perfection.
Right.
A renewal that goes beyond just the human experience.
Okay.
It raises some fascinating questions about the interconnectedness of all things and the ultimate purpose of creation.
It makes you think about the significance of our actions,
Yes.
of our stewardship of creation.
Right.
If even the physical world is caught up in this grand narrative of redemption and renewal.
Exactly. And this brings us to the heart of Charnock's argument. God's unchangeableness
Right.
amidst a universe in constant flux.
Right.
He connects this to God's very name, Jehovah, meaning I am the
Sure.
self-existent one, eternally unchanging.
So we're not just talking about God being steadfast or reliable.
Right.
We're talking about a fundamental attribute of his being.
Exactly.
He is.
Yes.
And that being is unchanging.
Exactly.
And Charnock breaks this down further,
Okay.
saying that God is immutable in three key areas.
Uh-huh.
His essence,
Yeah.
his knowledge, and his will.
Okay. Now we're getting into the nitty-gritty.
Yeah, let's start with his essence.
Okay.
What does it mean for God's essence to be immutable?
Charnock argues that God's being is fixed.
Okay.
He doesn't lose anything, and he doesn't gain anything.
Right.
If God's essence could change,
Yeah.
then he wouldn't truly be God.
Right.
He wouldn't be self-sufficient
Oh, shit.
in himself.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
If God was constantly evolving or being added to,
Mm-hmm.
it would imply that he wasn't perfect to begin with,
But
that he was
explain.
lacking something.
Right.
It undermines the very idea of God as the ultimate and absolute being.
Precisely. And this leads us to the second area of God's immutability,
Right.
his knowledge.
Okay.
Charnock emphasizes that God's knowledge is perfect and complete from eternity.
This is where I get a little tripped up.
Okay.
If God knows everything from eternity,
Right.
does that mean we don't have free will?
Mm-hmm.
Does it make our choices meaningless if they're already known?
That's a question that has puzzled theologians for centuries.
Yeah.
And Charnock addresses it head on.
Okay.
He argues that God's knowledge doesn't force our actions.
Okay.
It's not as if God knows will choose A, so we're compelled to choose A.
Right.
Rather, God being outside of time sees all of time at once.
So it's not that our choices are predetermined.
Right.
It's that God's knowledge encompasses all possibilities and all actualities simultaneously.
Imagine a being who can see the entire timeline of the universe at a single glance.
Okay.
God's knowledge is like that.
Mm-hmm.
He sees our choices not as events that cause his knowledge to change,
but as expressions of our free will within his eternal awareness.
That's mind-boggling, but it also brings a sense of comfort.
Yeah.
If God knows the entirety of my life, even my mistakes and failures, and he still loves me, that's a profound and humbling thought.
It's a perspective that shifts our focus from our limited understanding of time and sequence to God's eternal perspective.
Right.
And it underscores the depth of his love and grace.
So we've talked about God's essence and his knowledge.
Right.
What about his will?
Okay.
How does his immutability affect the way he acts in the world?
Charnock describes God's decrees as mountains of brass.
Oh, wow.
Rooted in perfect wisdom and backed by unstoppable power. If God's purpose could change, it would imply weakness, a lack of foresight, or even a change of heart due to unforeseen circumstances.
But wouldn't that make God seem distant?
Yeah.
Like he set things in motion and then just stepped back?
How can an immutable God interact with a world that's constantly changing?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And it leads us to a really important distinction.
Go.
God's immutability doesn't mean he's inactive or indifferent to our lives. Rather, his actions are always consistent with his unchanging character and eternal decrees.
So God's responses to our prayers, his interventions in history, are all expressions of his unchanging will, not reactions to external circumstances.
It's like a composer who writes a symphony.
Okay.
The score remains the same.
Right.
But the music comes alive through the performance of the musicians.
So God's immutability isn't about him being a passive observer.
Right.
It's about his actions being rooted in an unchanging purpose.
Exactly.
And an unwavering love.
And this brings us to an intriguing analogy that Charnock uses to illustrate God's immutability. He compares God to the unit in mathematics.
Okay, now we're getting into some interesting territory. I'm curious to see how this analogy plays out.
Think about it this way.
Okay.
The number one, the unit, remains the same no matter what other numbers you add to it.
It gives them value.
Yes.
But it never changes its own value.
Precisely.
Okay.
And Charnock connects this to God, saying that God, like the unit, remains eternally the same, even as he interacts with and brings change to the created world.
It's like saying that God is the constant, the anchor in a universe of variables.
Exactly. And as we navigate the complexities of life, experiencing joy and sorrow, triumph and defeat, it's incredibly reassuring to know that God is the one thing that remains unchanged.
Yeah.
He is the bedrock of reality, the source of all truth and goodness, and his character and promises are as true today as they were yesterday and will be tomorrow.
This has been an incredibly insightful dive into God's immutability, but we've only scratched the surface.
Yeah.
We'll be back for part 2. Where we'll continue unpacking this profound attribute and its implications for our lives.
Okay.
Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Contemporary Conversations on Christian Classics for more explorations of timeless Christian wisdom.
Awesome.
All right.
Sounds good. Picking up where we left off, the analogy of the unit really highlights how God can be both intimately involved in our lives and yet completely unaffected by the changes and fluctuations we experience.
It's almost paradoxical.
Yeah.
We're talking about a God who is both close and transcendent, involved in the minutiae of our lives, yet existing outside of time and space.
Precisely. And this leads us to another fascinating point that Charnock makes about God's immutability. He says it also applies to God's place, or rather, his lack of place.
Okay, now that's a head-scratcher. How can a God who is everywhere not be in any particular place?
Think of it this way. Because God is omnipresent, he fills all of space and time. He doesn't move from one point to another because he already occupies every point simultaneously.
So when we read in Scripture about God coming down or drawing near, it's not a literal change in location, but rather a description of how he manifests his presence or power in a particular way.
Exactly. Imagine a light bulb illuminating a room. The bulb itself doesn't move, but its light reaches every corner.
That's a helpful analogy. It clarifies how God can be unchangeable in his essence and yet actively involved in the world he created.
And Charnock doesn't just assert God's immutability. He backs it up with scriptural and philosophical reasoning.
I am all ears. What are some of the arguments he presents?
Well, first he points to the name Jehovah, which signifies I am, the eternal, unchanging one. But Charnock goes even deeper, examining the grammatical structure of the name itself. He notes that it never takes on different forms or plural endings.
So even the way God's name is constructed in the Hebrew language points to his unchangeableness. It's like it's woven into the very fabric of language.
That's a great observation. And then Charnock takes a more philosophical approach, arguing that if God were changeable, he couldn't be the most perfect being.
I can see where he's going with that. Perfection implies completeness, wholeness, the absence of any deficiency.
Right. So if God could change, it would either mean he was lacking something before the change, or that he became less than perfect after the change. Both scenarios contradict the idea of God as the ultimate unchanging good.
It's like saying that if something could be improved, then it wasn't truly perfect in the first place.
Exactly. And Charnock goes on to connect God's immutability to his simplicity.
When we talk about God's simplicity, we're not talking about something simplistic.
No, not at all. By simplicity, we mean that God is not composed of parts or components. He is a unified, indivisible being.
So if he were changeable, it would imply that some parts of him were changing while others remain the same. That would contradict his fundamental unity and wholeness.
Precisely. Change requires complexity, whereas God's essence is pure simplicity.
This is all incredibly thought-provoking, but I have to admit, my mind is starting to feel a bit stretched.
I understand. These are deep concepts, but they're worth wrestling with because they have profound implications for how we understand God and our relationship with him. Shall we take a moment to recap what we've covered so far?
Yes, let's do that. We've been talking about God's immutability, this foundational truth that God doesn't change.
Right.
We've explored how this is reflected in his essence, his knowledge, and his will. We've also delved into the idea that God's immutability extends even to his place, meaning that he is not limited by space or time. And we've touched on the scriptural and philosophical arguments that Charnock presents to support this doctrine.
Excellent summary. Now are you ready to dive back into the deep end?
I think so. Lead the way.
All right, let's pick up with Charnock's discussion of God's eternity and how it relates to his immutability. He argues that any change, even a seemingly positive one, implies a beginning and an end. If God could change, it would mean he wasn't always what he is now, or that he might not always be what he is now.
That makes sense. It would suggest that some aspect of him came into being at a particular point in time, which would contradict the concept of eternity.
Exactly. And remember, change always happens within the confines of time. One moment precedes the change, another moment follows it. But God, as the eternal one, is outside of time and therefore beyond the reach of change.
That's a beautiful way to think about it. Time is the canvas on which change is painted, but God is the artist who exists beyond the canvas.
That's a great analogy. But now I want to push you a little further. Charnock doesn't shy away from the tough questions. He addresses the idea that if God is unchangeable, how can he possibly respond to our prayers or act in history?
That's something I've wrestled with myself. If God is truly unchanging, wouldn't that make him incapable of interacting with a world that is constantly changing? Wouldn't it make him distant and impersonal?
Those are valid concerns, and I think they stem from a misunderstanding of what God's immutability truly means. Charnock explains that God's immutability doesn't mean he's static or inactive. Rather, it means that his actions and responses are always consistent with his unchanging character and eternal decrees.
So God's responses to our prayers, his interventions in history, are all part of his preordained plan, a plan that flows from his unchanging will and wisdom.
Exactly. Think of it like a composer's score. The music itself doesn't change, but it's expressed through the individual performances of the musicians.
It's like God is composing the grand symphony of history, and our lives are the individual notes that contribute to the overall melody.
I love that. And it just as a composer knows how every note will fit into the final composition, God knows how our prayers, our choices, and even our struggles all fit into his eternal plan.
It's a thought that's both humbling and awe-inspiring. It reminds me that even though I may not always understand God's ways or see the bigger picture, he is working all things together for good according to his purpose.
Yes, and that brings us to another crucial aspect of God's immutability, his power or omnipotence.
Okay, we're back to those essential attributes. Essence, knowledge, and power. How does God's immutability connect to his omnipotence?
Charnock argues that if God could change, it would imply either a lack of power to prevent that change or a change in his power itself. Both scenarios contradict the very definition of omnipotence.
So if something outside of God could force a change upon him, it would mean he's not truly all-powerful.
Precisely. And if God's power itself could increase or decrease, it would mean there was a time when he wasn't all-powerful, which again is a contradiction.
It's like saying a truly infinite being can't become more or less infinite.
You've got it. God's his essence and knowledge is an unchangeable eternal attribute. It's the bedrock on which all of creation rests.
It's amazing how these concepts, essence, knowledge, power, are all intertwined and point back to God's ultimate immutability. It's like a tapestry where each thread contributes to the overall picture of God's perfect and unchanging nature.
And all of this has implications for how we live our lives. If God is this unchanging, all-powerful, all-knowing being, what does that mean for our understanding of trust, of hope, of perseverance in the face of trials?
Those are great questions. Maybe we can explore those further in part 3 of our deep dive.
I think that's an excellent place to pause. Let's give our listeners some time to process all of this. But before we do, I want to leave them with a thought to ponder. As you go about your day, think about how this concept of God's immutability affects your perspective on the world, on your own life, and on your relationship with God.
Welcome back to Contemporary Conversations on Christian Classics, where we explore timeless Christian content that continues to inspire today. We're wrapping up our deep dive into Chapter 6 of Stephen Charnock's The Existence and Attributes of God. We've been unpacking this profound concept of God's immutability, his unchanging nature.
It's been a rich discussion, hasn't it?
Yes, it has.
And as we delve into the final section of this chapter, I think you'll find that Charnock brings it all together in a way that's both intellectually stimulating and deeply comforting.
I'm ready to have my mind stretched and my soul encouraged. Where do we go from here?
Well, we ended part 2 talking about the seeming paradox of an unchanging God interacting with a changing world. And Charnock actually uses the very reality of change in the world to highlight the unchanging nature of God.
It's like he's saying that against the backdrop of a constantly shifting universe, God's immutability stands out even more. It becomes the one fixed point, the one constant we can cling to.
Precisely. And this leads to another fascinating argument that Charnock puts forward. He suggests that the world, with all its complexity and order, couldn't exist without an immutable principle governing it.
It's like saying that without a fixed point of reference, everything would just dissolve into chaos.
Yeah.
We need that anchor of unchanging truth in order to make sense of the world around us.
Exactly. And Charnock uses both the moral and natural realms to illustrate this point.
Okay.
In the moral realm, he talks about how the principles of conscience are deeply rooted within us, even though our outward behavior might fluctuate.
So even though we might make mistakes or stray from what we know is right, there's still a deep-seated sense of right and wrong that anchors us. This moral compass, this innate understanding of good and evil, points to a source beyond ourselves, a source that is unchanging and absolute.
That's a great way to put it. And then in the natural realm, we see how even the seemingly chaotic movements of the heavens and earth are governed by fixed laws and principles.
Right.
The seasons change, the tides ebb and flow, but there's an underlying order and predictability to it all.
It's like a beautifully choreographed dance, with each element moving in harmony with the others. And behind this intricate dance, there's a choreographer, an unmoved mover who set it all in motion and sustains it by his unchanging will.
Beautifully said. That unmoved mover, of course, is the immutable God that Charnock has been pointing us to throughout this chapter. And this leads us to what I find to be one of the most profound and comforting aspects of God's immutability.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Charnock argues that because God is unchanging, he is the ultimate source of comfort and satisfaction for the human soul.
Now that resonates deeply with me. Why is God's immutability such a source of comfort, especially in a world that often feels so chaotic and unpredictable?
Well, think about it this way. Our hearts are restless. We long for something that can truly fulfill us, something that won't let us down, something that won't change or fade away.
And so often we search for that fulfillment in things that are by nature changeable. Relationships, possessions, achievements, even our own feelings and emotions.
Exactly. And the problem is those things can never fully satisfy us because they're all subject to the same forces of change and decay that govern the rest of the created world.
Right.
Relationships can falter, possessions can be lost on, achievements can lose their luster, and our emotions are constantly ebbing and flowing.
But God, because he's immutable, is the one constant, the one anchor in a sea of change. His love never fails. His promises never fade. His character never wavers. In him and in him alone we can find true rest and lasting peace.
You've captured it perfectly, and that's why Charnock emphasizes that only God can truly satisfy the infinite desires of the human soul. Only in a relationship with the unchanging God can we find a stability and security that transcends the storms of life.
It's like finding a solid rock to stand on amidst the swirling currents of life. It's a place of refuge, a source of strength, an anchor for our souls.
That's a beautiful image, and I think it captures the essence of what Charnock is trying to convey. In a world that's constantly changing, in a life that's filled with ups and downs, we can rest secure in the knowledge that God is unchanging.
Right.
He is the same yesterday, today, and forever.
This has been such a rich and thought-provoking exploration of God as immutability. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to challenge our listeners to ponder a few questions.
Okay.
If God is the unchanging anchor in a changing world, how does that knowledge affect the way you approach your own life? Does it give you a sense of peace, a sense of purpose, or maybe even a new perspective on the challenges you face?
And I would add, if God's character and promises are unchanging, how does that inspire you to live differently, to love more deeply, and to trust more fully in the one who is the same yesterday, today, and forever?
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the immutability of God. We hope it sparked some new insights and inspired you to explore Charnock's The Existence and Attributes of God for yourself. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Contemporary Conversations on Christian Classics for more explorations of timeless Christian wisdom.